Okay. The ARC project, just to give you a little bit of background, the ARC project, we're entering the last 5 months of our project. And basically the purpose of the project, it supports USAID in helping, especially in the Africa and Latin America regions, helping understand what vulnerability to climate change is and how you can address it. We work closely with USAID, the Africa Bureau, Latin America Bureau, and missions and regions in Latin America and Africa, helping improve this understanding. And we're doing a lot about learning about what it means to assess vulnerability, and that's why we focused a lot on vulnerability assessments. The Uganda vulnerability assessment was the first one that we conducted about 2 years ago. And we actually presented it publicly in Uganda and had an options analysis about 1.5 years ago. I'm going to be presenting, because I was a team leader actually for this assessment in Uganda. I'm going to present the study, the methodology, and basically the findings and preliminary recommendations. And Hadas, who was our counterpart on the ground at USAID Uganda, will be presenting what has basically happened with these findings after the assessment was done. Okay, so she's going to be addressing a bit of uptake. So we're going to go beyond just sort of how the assessment was conducted and what the findings are. ARC has also done other assessments in other parts of the world. In Africa, we've done them in Malawi, Senegal, Mali. We've done a combination of different studies, as well as West Africa, the Dominican Republic, Southern Honduras, and Western Honduras. So at the end of the presentation, although we're presenting on Uganda, we can share with you some of our other experiences. We're putting together a compendium, basically presenting the learning that we've had around these experiences at the end of the project, and we hope to be presenting that in September. That's just the background. Okay, here we are in Uganda. The purpose of the study, when we define this in close collaboration with USAID, because it was for USAID, to inform food security programming and investment decisions in their portfolio. So it was really important when we went there. We had discussions with a number of people on their team. How do you really want to how do you want to invest climate change adaptation funds, basically? And they really wanted to do it through their food security programs. And so we worked a bit to come up with a primary research question that we could all agree on. And basically it's how will projected changes in climate affect important agricultural value chains in Uganda and the livelihoods of villagers who rely upon these value chains. They already had Feed the Future programming going on there, so they helped us define the sites. Our overall approach, which we've used in all of our assessments, is really, we use the definition of vulnerability as a function of exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. So basically we go in and we look at what may happen in terms of climate change based on past trends, how that will impact on natural systems and the communities we're talking about in terms of sensitivity, and how they will have been and can respond to these impacts over time, adaptive capacity. Okay, the goals of the assessment process was to provide an objective, evidence-based climate change study that will be useful to the Ugandan agriculture and food security communities. So it did go beyond USAID as sort of the primary beneficiary of the study, and Hadas will be explaining more about that. Support innovation in climate change adaptation programming. This was something relatively new, especially to the Uganda mission. Improve understanding of climate change vulnerability, how to assess it and address it. That seems pretty basic, but we found that there was a lot of learning that happened through this process about what vulnerability to climate change is and how you can address it. And it was to guide their programming in USAID. We had an interesting group of people around the table. It wasn't just the agriculture folks. We had other economic development, environmental. We even had health folks, education, and program folks that we worked with. Communication and stakeholder involvement was essential throughout the process. That's some of the learning I was talking about. and sort of being on the same page in terms of concepts and definitions. Okay, the methodology. It was a quite complex, multi-scale, and multi-component methodology that we use. We started with a climate analysis where we looked at historical observations, temperature, precipitation over two periods, 1951 to 80 and 1980 to 2010. You may be surprised that we were able to find that data in Uganda, but it was there. We had to help work with the local Met Service to help organize it and clean it, but it was also strategic in helping us decide where we would focus the study. We focused it in 6 districts. These were Feed the Future districts anyway, and they represented a variety of different agroecological zones, which was important. But more importantly, where you see these flags is where they had Met stations. And we had to basically be able to relate the data in these stations to our analysis. Okay, so that helped also define the 6 areas. For those of you who are familiar with Uganda, it was Luero, Mbale, Lira, Gulu, Kasese, and Esinjiro, 6 districts. We also did climate modeling and statistical downscaling. And we did a livelihoods analysis, 800 household surveys, looking basically at food security issues and sort of the socioeconomic status of these households. And we supplemented that with qualitative discussions, focus group discussions, which looked a little bit more closely. We did 2 in each community, one with women and one with men. And we looked at basically perceptions of weather over time and farming changes that had occurred over time over the last 20 years in their history, and looked at what brought those about, because we wanted a better sense of how farmers themselves were adapting to these climate changes. Then we did a crop analysis. We did 8 crop value chain assessments of the 8 primary crops and phenological screening to get a sense of, for both of those value chains and the phenological screening, where there was vulnerability to climate change. Water resource analysis, although we did not do, it was relatively, we did that by secondary lit review, and we found that, in fact, surface water wasn't a critical issue at this point in time, so we didn't delve further into that. Okay, the climate change findings. Interannual rainfall variability is high. It has been historically, and it will continue to be. No robust and significant change in annual mean rainfall projected for the 2015 to 2045 period, but this variability that they have been experiencing will continue. Projection of potential increase in precipitation in December to February season, dry season in all location. Basically what this means is that the traditional dry season will very likely be wetter, which has an impact on particularly post-harvest handling. And a consistent and significant warming trend has been observed, is projected to increase. There is a potential for increase in the frequency of extreme events, that actually storms, the perception is that storms have become more intense, and we believe that that will continue, especially as the temperature rises. Current rainfall and temperature levels are suitable for agriculture throughout the entire country. Nevertheless, changes in local rainfall seasonality may negatively impact on crop value chains and increase livelihood vulnerabilities. Those are the main climate findings. Crop sensitivity. Again, I'm just going over the tops of the trees. This study was very deep. There's a lot of data to support this. Giving you the high points, okay? We did, as I mentioned, we did crop value chain analyses and phenological studies. We basically found out that coffee and matoke, which is the East African banana, are the most vulnerable to climate change. With rising temperatures, both Arabica and Robusta coffee will likely shift up the altitude profile as they try to reach cooler temperatures as the temperature rises. Erratic precipitation and rising temperatures will also probably reduce productivity. Maize, beans, and rice are considered moderately vulnerable. Rising temperatures unlikely to affect production, although maize is greatly affected by short-term water stress or hail, particularly during the production period, I guess the flowering period. Beans develop significant fungal and viral diseases, which are affected by increasing temperatures, warmer temperatures, and variations of moisture. And growing conditions for rice are suboptimal. Sorghum, cassava, and sweet potato are less vulnerable. They have more efficient photosynthesis, water retention, utilization of sorghum, adaptable to a wide range of climatic conditions. Both sweet potato and cassava grow well in excess of temperature increases and are both highly vulnerable to diseases and pests. Diseases and pests we found are quite a big issue all across the board. Coffee and matoke are also quite vulnerable because rust can become worse with rising temperatures and erratic moisture. And once you lose a whole plantation of coffee, it's very hard to reestablish it. So same with matoke, actually. There's also a banana wilt that's affecting matoke. Household sensitivity. When we analyzed the data from the 800 household survey, we did a principal component analysis based on basically assets and income within the households. And we found that almost all households are vulnerable. These are all subsistence farmers in these areas that we studied, but that 3/4 of the sample are considered most vulnerable. I mean, just living on the edge, they have very little assets to fall back on in case of some disaster or risk. These are some of the characteristics of the least vulnerable households, which is the 1/4 we're talking about. Have more producers relative to non-producers and better educated, have physical assets that can be partially liquidated in the event of crisis, have access to financial capital, crop sales, animal sales, off-farm income, and cultivate their own social capital. So in all these different capitals, they were better off than 3/4 of the group, which fell into the most vulnerable households that have higher dependency ratios, many female-headed households. I think it was almost 30%. It varied across in the different areas. Food security is a measure of urgency. Longer periods of food insecurity in 2011. Food security deteriorated while the less vulnerable households on average improved. They really had nothing to fall back on in difficult times if their crop failed, 3/4 of the households. We defined 3 different adaptive paths in terms of coming up with ways to address the vulnerability of these farming households. Technical solutions, we felt that in the area of research a lot more could be done in national research programs, working on drought-resistant seeds, how to prevent and treat pests and diseases, and much more on climate information. It was nice to find that the climate data is there in many places, but the government of Uganda really didn't know what to do with that data, okay, in terms of using it to be able to inform future policy and programs and how they should do their research. The extension services we found out were not that effective. We did an institutional analysis when we did this study. We went in and we looked at what institutions were doing, government and NGOs, and we found that there was a pretty good intention on the national level and even the district level, but when we went to the village level to do the surveys, they weren't being visited by the extension workers, maybe once a year from the agriculture extension workers. Anyway, the farmers already are doing some very interesting adaptive practices to the issues that they're facing. They're intercropping, and we found quite a few soil and water management techniques that they're already engaging in. And a lot of these actually came from farmer to farmer, not so much introduced from externally from NGOs or the government. Working on functioning input markets, help in organization, quality control, and investment. Investment solutions, expand livestock, plant trees, crops, invest in build irrigation, increase access to village savings and loan associations. There are very active programs in Uganda at the community level promoting village and savings and loans that are really quite successful. So that should be built on. And then diversifying. So these two are really within agriculture, the technical solutions and the investment solutions. And then the diversification is diversifying within agriculture, but also outside of agriculture. We were surprised that the community in Uganda realized this and were receptive and to looking for solutions to this as well, although it's a hard one. Create income streams protected from climate variation, including shopkeeping, skilled trades, agro-processing, and other rural professions and activities. Recommendations, Hadas will explain this a little bit more. We went in, after we did the study, we went into Uganda and we presented the findings to various groups, stakeholder groups, and we facilitated a process in which the primary stakeholders generated options and recommendations. So we didn't really come in with draft recommendations. The community there, based on our findings, helped generate these. And they fell basically into three different, primary strategies: strengthen understanding, dissemination, and use of climate information in Uganda, promote the intensification and diversification of agriculture production, and then create enabling conditions to diversify household income streams toward climate neutral livelihoods. So that was sort of the three broad strategies that we helped. And then from there, we came up with more specific recommendations and activities. Okay, Hadas, I think this is your part.
Too many things. Okay, so I'm going to sort of pick up where Trish left off and talk a little bit more about communication, uptake, and impact of the assessment. One thing that's really, I think, very exciting about this assessment is Trish mentioned that it was about 2 years ago when the assessment was done, but we've actually been working with the assessment from 2 years ago when it started up until a month or two ago. It's still out there, it's still being used, it's still being communicated, and we're still building off of it. And so that's something that's very exciting, and you'll hear a little bit more about that. So, as Trish mentioned, when USAID Uganda went into doing this assessment, they had some internal programming goals. They knew they were designing a new set of adaptation programs, and they wanted this study to help inform that. But they also wanted the assessment to be valuable to the larger community in Uganda. And to do this, it meant there were a lot of different stakeholders and decision makers that were part of the process from the beginning in terms of scoping and also field work, but also in terms of the people we wanted to communicate with. And this is sort of, the laundry list of all the types of people that we were trying to reach out to throughout the process. And there's a number of different messages that we were trying to communicate depending on the different stages of communication. And these messages were just the basic messages about what the assessment would cover and why USAID is doing a vulnerability assessment, why climate change is important, and what kind of impacts it'll have on agriculture, what the results of the assessment actually were, and what type of uncertainty exists within those findings, and also what can be done to respond to climate change impacts on agriculture in Uganda. Communicating with all those different stakeholders and communicating all those different things brings up a number of challenges. I'm sure many of you are familiar with these challenges and deal with them on a daily basis. The first one is just that climate change is a complex topic and it's often misunderstood. This sort of happened in Uganda, at least at two levels. The first is that there's just inherent uncertainty in climate projections, and you have to be able to communicate uncertainty in a way that people can understand, and that's very difficult. And the other thing that's really common in Uganda is just the confusion over what climate change is and what it isn't. There's this tendency to lump everything into the climate change category. It's land degradation, it's deforestation, wetland destruction, it's tsunamis. people actually say that. So, there's this idea that everything now is climate change and everything is because of climate change, and it becomes really clear that you need very clear messaging about, what is climate change, what isn't climate change, how is it impacting agriculture, and what are the other stressors on agriculture and livelihoods that don't actually have anything to do with climate change, but that together with climate change really make things difficult for farmers in Uganda. The other thing that was especially challenging, again, Trish said she just got to the tip of the iceberg in terms of what the methods were and what the results were of that assessment, but it's a really complicated assessment. It went into depth in a number of different areas using a number of different methodologies, and there's a challenge in how to communicate that in a way that shows that it's robust, but at the same time doesn't bog people down with too many details about the nitty-gritty, about the statistics on a livelihood analysis and things like that. And that can be very challenging. And then the last challenge had to be just around the different types of audiences that we were dealing with very differing levels of technical knowledge. And so we had a group of people who were climate experts but may not have been agriculture experts. We had a group of people that were agriculture experts that maybe didn't know much about climate change. And then we had a whole host of non-technical experts in government and non-government at the district level. And then also implementing partners that weren't familiar with natural resources and environment work at all. Implementing partners that were from the health sector or education sector or other sectors. And so it's a challenge. I mean, you can't have sort of one document that's going to speak to all of those people, and you have to think about what are the different ways in which we need to communicate to these different groups so that the information is accessible to them. So to do this, we had a number of different methods of communicating to the various stakeholders, both verbal and written. And these are things that, like I already mentioned, these aren't things that just sort of started when the assessment finished. These are things that we were doing throughout the whole process at different stages in the process. And these are things that the mission and ARC were working very closely together on in collaboration. And then I'll talk about a little of these in the next few slides. So the first part of stakeholder involvement in community happened during the assessment itself. The initial scoping phase, when the ARC team came out, they went and consulted with a number of different individuals from a number of different organizations, over 60 individuals from 34 different organizations and government, nonprofit, research, a whole sort of array of people were consulted. And they were consulted because what the team was trying to figure out was what's already been done here, what types of information do we need to do this assessment, what is an appropriate approach for this assessment based on the needs of all these stakeholders, and then where are the data sources. So, somebody might say they want X, Y, and Z in an assessment, but if we can't get that data, then we can't really move forward with it. And so it was a really important part of the process. During the fieldwork stage, there was also a lot of stakeholder involvement. A local firm was used to collect all the household livelihood information. And the climate work that Trish talked about, so digitizing all of the weather information, doing the trends analysis and the projections, that was all done in coordination and collaboration with the Department of Meteorology and the National Agricultural Research Organization. And then lastly, what Trish already touched on was the options analysis portion, which was once results of the assessment were there, the team had some initial ideas about recommendations, but they didn't want to be prescriptive about it. And so they came back to Uganda and hosted a workshop for some of the key stakeholders in the sector, in the agriculture climate change sort of sector. It was about over 50 participants, very diverse representation. And the point of this options analysis workshop was partially just to build awareness about climate change again, understanding about climate change and some of the challenges, understanding of the results of the assessment itself, but also to have these groups sit down and work together and actually develop some recommendations, which the team could then take forward and develop into some more detailed recommendations, which finally were included in the final reports. The other thing that we did with the team was put together a number of different presentations and also a number of different types of communications documents. So we had two types of presentations. We did very targeted presentations as well as a broad presentation. So the targeted presentations were really for small groups of key decision makers within USAID, within the government of Uganda, the research community, and the donor community. And this was a chance for the entire research team who traveled back to Uganda to sit down with people who we were really targeting to use this information with, to hear the results, and then to be able to sit and really have a conversation and ask the questions that were important to them. We also did a very broad presentation, invited everybody to come, this we actually did relatively recently in November. Well, not that recently. It feels recent. November. Feels like it was just last week. In November, and we were really surprised because at this point the assessment had been out, it had been handed to people, we've already done the options assessment, we'd already done all the small group activities, and we sort of thought, okay, maybe 30, 40 people would want to come and hear about it again, but hasn't everybody heard the presentation? And we were surprised we had over 90 people show up. We had to change rooms at the last minute because the interest was so strong, and even people who had been involved in some of the earlier stages of hearing about it wanted to come back and hear about it again. And so that part was exciting. In terms of written communication tools, we had two versions of an executive summary. So we had a very short, punchy version, which was meant for high-level sort of key decision makers. We had an executive summary that went into the main body of the report, slightly more technical. The full report itself, which was again meant for a more technical audience, but again, because you have a climate component, you have these ag value chains, you have livelihoods, you have to make sure that the people who don't study livelihoods understand the climate part, and the people who don't study climate understand the ag part. And so it's really important that even though it's sort of a technical report, that it was very accessible to a large number of individuals. There's a series of annexes which are really detailed if you really want to get into some of the technical details. And then a very short 2-page document that was just on the climate findings. And this sort of came out of what we realized was nobody had ever done the kind of trends and projection analysis for Uganda's climate that this team had done. And some people may not be interested in agriculture, they just want to know what's going on with the climate. And so this was a really useful sort of document that we had the team produce after the fact. And then the last written documents we had produced were district scenarios. And as Trish mentioned, there were 6 districts where they conducted the sort of field work for the vulnerability assessment. And so these are 4 to 5 page documents that sort of map on what the full report looks like, only with the specific information to the district. So what are the trends and projections for climate in the district? What are the livelihood patterns? What are the issues with the different crops? And we found these to be very helpful to inform our own work at the district level, but also a lot of other donors working in some of these districts and areas have already sort of called upon them and asked us for copies because they're interested in what's going on in Mbale and Mount Elgon and not necessarily what's going on everywhere in Uganda. So the next thing that we embarked on, and this actually happened in October, November of 2013, is these district workshops. And I sort of call this slide, I called it Transforming Assessments into Action, because it was the first step in some work that we've been doing at the district level through one of our Feed the Future activities. So we have a Feed the Future activity called Enabling Environment for Agriculture. And one of their objectives is to work closely with the district governments to help them use national climate change mainstreaming guidelines to integrate climate change into their district development plans. And so these workshops were the first step in doing that. And the way that we did that was we used the vulnerability assessment as an entry point to the 6 districts as sort of a phase 1 for enabling environment in terms of their district engagement. And this came about very nicely and easily in a certain extent because USAID Uganda already has an existing platform for engaging with districts. There's a a number of focus districts that the mission as a whole has chosen to work with. And they've developed these district operational plans, which are essentially memorandums of understanding between USAID, our implementing partners, and the district local government to develop a platform for information sharing, which is essentially a quarterly meeting that's held at each district where our implementing partners and USAID and the district all come together, and there's sort of an exchange of information. You know, the different health partners and the different education partners will talk about what they've been doing and what their plans are, and vice versa. The district will also talk about where they are in their work. And so these had already been going on for about a year, and so we decided to sort of capitalize on this opportunity to bring the climate change work down, starting with the 6 districts that the vulnerability assessment happened in. And again, a range of attendees, district local government, which includes district technical staff, but also includes, you know, the district planner and the district political leaders, as well as a lot of our implementing partners. And most of the implementing partners in these districts are actually health and education partners, and not necessarily a lot of environment or natural resources partners. And so it was, again, a group that had both the technical knowledge of climate change and agriculture and people in the group who were not very familiar with these topics. And we had 4 objectives for the workshop. The first was just to improve understanding of climate change globally and locally, to improve understanding of climate change adaptation and what adaptation options were in the agriculture sector for the district, to begin to formulate action plans to address climate change at the district level, and also to introduce the new project, Enabling Environment, which was going to carry these action plans forward and work more with the districts on integrating climate change into their development plans. These were, I have to say, they were a lot of fun because the districts are not used to people coming back and bringing information back to them. They're very used to people coming out and taking information, and not a lot of people go back and sort of follow through. And so, you know, one great thing to see was just how excited they were that we were presenting, how excited they were to learn, even if it was a health implementing partner who had never, you know, thought about climate change and its connection to health before. You know, they were very engaged and they were very excited. We made an effort to make it very participatory, so it wasn't just a presentation. There were breakout groups and plenary discussions, and there was a lot of excitement generated, and, you know, a lot of the questions at the very end were, so what's next? And luckily we could say, well, what's next is, because we have an implementing partner who is going to continue to work with those districts, and since has. So since this has happened, there's been another series of workshops at the districts. There's also been a training of trainers where they've taken some of the district technical staff and brought them together to learn more about these issues, and the follow through, you know, continues. As Enabling Environment continues. So that's very exciting for us. Stepping back to the larger picture again, just to talk a little bit about the response to the assessment, both within USAID and also externally. The response to the assessment, I think from the beginning, was very positive. Even when it was just in the scoping and planning phase, people were really excited that the mission was taking on this kind of project, that we were doing more than a desk study, that we were really trying to get into some of the analysis, some of the original research, and some of the data collection to delve into these issues. And so the kinds of messages we were hearing back, you know, every time the ARC team came out, because they came a number of times, were just that it's wonderful that we have this high quality climate change analysis for Uganda. You know, USAID doesn't often do that kind of original research where we go down and interview 800 households and gather that kind of information. The fact that it's really a good foundational document, not just for our own internal programs, but for external stakeholders. And there was especially a lot of excitement about the district level engagement, and that combined with the assessment really helped raise the profile of climate change within the embassy and within the mission. The mission director, the ambassador, they want to hear about climate change now. Of course it helps. The Secretary Kerry also is interested in climate change. But before Secretary Kerry was interested in climate change, this was happening, and the ambassador heard about the assessment, and the ambassador was, we were getting, it was while the assessment was being written up, and we were getting, knocks on our door every few minutes or phone calls saying, not every few minutes, but every few weeks saying, so we heard about the assessment, when is it ready? We want to copy the executive summary for the ambassador. And so we kept on. It really has helped within the mission raise the profile of our work, which is exciting. As Trish mentioned earlier, one of the initial reasons for doing the assessment was we wanted to influence our own programming. We were at a phase in our design process where we were designing a number of new adaptation activities. And so the assessment helped us very much figure out, where are the gaps, what could we do, what's our added value, and it helped us design a whole series of new climate change adaptation programs that are integrated very nicely into our Feed the Future program, which has been great. It also helped inform work planning for a number of Feed the Future activities. Most of those activities had already been awarded, but were just in the startup phases. And so this came at a really good time to help inform their work plans. And we're just about done. I sort of couldn't figure out which slide to put this last one on because we're almost done in developing a few more products for other portfolios. So the ARC team has developed 3 overview documents that take the climate change trends and projections and look at how they might impact other sectors. So we looked at biodiversity, health, and infrastructure. The other thing that's been going on is that the assessment's being used by other non-USAID stakeholders. The World Bank and GIZ have both used it as a background document for program design. The National Planning Authority is going through this mainstreaming exercise right now, trying to mainstream climate change into the next national development plan they're developing, and this is one of the key reference documents. It's also a key reference document for the Ministry of Agriculture as they put together an action plan for their climate change task force. I already mentioned it's being used by IPs to integrate climate change adaptation into their programs. And it's also being used as a basis and also as baseline data for a research program that's developed out of some of the work that the ARC team has done. One fun thing that has happened is that sort of in February, March, I went to a few meetings, and at both of these meetings, different things were being discussed, and someone else in the room, not me, raised their hand and said, have you seen USAID's vulnerability assessment study? Because that would be a really useful document for this context. So, and I secretly sort of smiled to myself that it's nice that I'm not the only one doing this, and keeping in mind that it's almost a year since the assessment has been out. And, people are still talking about it, and that, I think that speaks to the fact that we've just continued to kind of use it and push it and communicate it. Lots of people have been saying wonderful things about the assessment, which is great. Some of it I think I've already mentioned in terms of internal to USAID. A few things I wanted to highlight, which some people said to me that I didn't even realize was not the objective or what we thought the value would be, one person, a lot of people are working on water resources and water resource management and hydrological modeling, and they had no idea that weather data existed. And they're blown away by the fact that there's 60 years of weather data out there that they can now use to help inform their work. And now they know it exists, and they know where to get it. They know who to talk to get it. And that's one value that this has brought that wasn't obvious from the beginning. Another one is just the fact that the bibliography on climate change that was put together. So anybody who's now new to Uganda who's going in and saying, we need to design a program, or I need to learn about, adaptation, it's all there. It's all, wonderful bibliography. A lot of information really helps you figure out where you can get access a lot of information. We also had some comments about how, it's obvious it's a key policy it's a key document for policymakers, but the kind of information that's in it could also be very useful to farmers. And it really needs to be simplified, translated into local languages, and used at the local level. And the person who said this was somebody from the World Bank, and she actually tasked the climate change unit within the Ministry of Water and Environment to do this. She said this is what they should be doing. They should be taking this assessment and translating it and bringing the information to farmers. And there's also been sentiment about how, yeah, it's great that people are still talking about it, but there's still people who don't know about it, and it needs to continue to be disseminated, especially within sort of government officials. So a few lessons learned along the way. I think one of the values of this assessment is that it was participatory from the start, that it's, we've been sort of on a 2-year journey with the ARC team, and part of that journey, part of them coming back and continuously working with us, and us going out and talking about the assessment has actually really helped foster a lot of interest and discussion about the assessment, and has really made people aware of it, much more aware than if the team had just come in, done the research, written the report, sent it to us. We would email the report out, and then it's kind of like a closed book and nobody sees it. But the fact that the team was back and forth, the fact that they were interacting with stakeholders from the scoping phase onward really, really helped. This thing, very obvious, I know, but I have to point it out, that this doesn't just happen. It takes a lot of work and a lot of effort to communicate this information and communicate it effectively. There's a lot of work gone into the written documents to make sure that they could be understood by technical audiences and yet be relevant to, or understood by non-technical audiences and relevant to the technical individuals. And obviously, doing these presentations, coming back to Uganda, especially when you're talking about tailoring presentations to the districts, and each district has its own presentation because there's information for each specific district. This takes a lot of time to plan and implement. And of course, there's still people out there that don't know this, that we thought we were communicating with, that we found out invited to have a presentation, and on all my email lists somehow still turn and say, oh, the USAID vulnerability assessment, that hasn't been published yet, has it? There's always more work to be done. But in general, I think, as I already mentioned, I think one of the wonderful things about this assessment is the fact that it had an initial purpose, and initial purpose was to help USAID with its programming, but USAID and Uganda had a vision that they wanted it to be useful to beyond that and for other stakeholders, and that we were really supported by the ARC team and by the Africa Bureau to continue to work with it and to continue to bring the team back and develop new products and do new work with it. And we didn't just sort of stop at the end of the assessment, but we really tried to use the information and use it well. So that, Trish and I can take questions.
If you want a full copy of the report, you can access it.
Yeah, the link, I'm going to say this to people on the webinar. The link that's up right now is where you can access the full report for the vulnerability assessment.
Since this was a first-of-a-kind assessment report for Uganda, what's your sense of the shelf life? How long is this assessment credible? When does it need to be refreshed? And that question goes for the other countries where assessments are ongoing or already completed as well in either region that you're working in.
So, I'm not going to put a number on the shelf life, but I think it's actually, since the assessment started, it's been a year since it's out. It's still being found to be very useful. When you're looking at 60 years of climate information and you're looking at projections that go out, we did 40 years, right? So you do have quite a lot of time, I think, to use this. And I could see it being used for a number of more years. And I also can see it being built upon. So you can also, actually, this is happening under our research project. They're updating the weather databases. So they have through 2010. through this project. So now they're updating them and they're putting in through 2013, and they're continuing to use that information and to do additional modeling work and also some modeling work with crops. So I think because it's a foundational document, because you're looking at climate and you're looking at these 30-year time slices, it will continue to be useful. Of course, there's always more that you could do, and more that could be built on this. But I see this being useful, at least for the next 5 years. And hopefully people will pick it up and do some additional analyses to extend the life further. So.
Yeah, I think we just had an experts meeting on this issue of uptake. And one thing that was really important in terms of how much these assessments are used is you really need local champions. You need good knowledge brokers. Actually, in Hadas's presentation, you could see good communications, really clearly addressing something, a felt need that people have, and that's important to them. And then basically having local champions, not just USAID, this went beyond USAID, that keep on using the information to inform their programs and policy. As you all know, it takes a long time to influence policy, and we hope these reports actually eventually get there as well.
Patricia, you said that it was raining more in the dry season, and I wonder if the data bore it out. Okay.
It did. It clicked with it. It absolutely did. It was interesting in all 6 districts where we did the downscaling. There was a very clear trend. Our climate scientist is very, very particular about how we address uncertainty. And she was very, it was very significant, not very significant, but significant trend toward a wetter dry season in all these 6 districts.
Thanks so much for the presentation. I have a couple questions about the impact on the Feed the Future work planning. So I'm curious to hear a bit about, first of all, what components of your study have been the most transferable through that work planning process, and secondly, whether there are certain countries, regions, contexts in which you think that this assessment is most appropriately applied.
So the Uganda Feed the Future program works at a couple of levels. One level is at that sort of policy enabling environment level, and then the other level is more through sort of agribusiness dealers and suppliers and sort of village agents that work with farmers. So the information was useful at both those levels. At the level of policy and enabling environment, that was the one Feed the Future activity that hadn't been designed yet when this assessment results were starting to come in. And so we ended up designing that as a joint climate change adaptation agriculture mechanism that does work in agricultural policy on seeds and fertilizers and all those things, but also has this component of climate change adaptation. And so what the assessment was able to do at that level was to identify what are the needs in terms of what are the needs at the policy level, what are the needs in terms of the government institutional level to deal with climate change adaptation in Uganda. And this project is able to sort of address some of those needs. And then when it comes to working at the other levels, especially the level of village agents and farmers, the stuff that came out to be most useful is, which of the crops are going to be most affected, why are they going to be most affected, and what can you do in terms of adaptation practices that these that are implementing partner on that project can use and integrate and then implement. Because they're working with these village agents who are teaching farmers all different things, again, inputs and seeds and, connecting them to markets. And now they can also talk about climate adaptation, and they could say, here's coffee in this area, and coffee in this area, you might see issues because of temperature increases because of X, Y, and Z, and here's some of the things that you can do about it. And that kind of information, detailed information, is in the assessment. And so that's been very useful. I'm not sure I answered the second part of your question, though.
The second part was just what countries or regions, other contexts that you find this study to be the most applicable in.
So, I don't know beyond Uganda. Uganda where it would be used necessarily. I think some of the neighboring countries could probably find a lot of the information useful. Certainly, a lot of the study areas actually bordered other countries. So a lot of the work that they looked at in Mbale, which is on the Mount Elgon region, borders Kenya. A lot of the issues with coffee that you find both in Mbale and in Kasese are going to be applicable in Rwanda. And so you could see some of this information applicable. Of course, you can't assume that the climate trends are going to be the same. Although obviously if you're on one side of Mount Elgon, on the other side of Mount Elgon, probably pretty similar. But certainly a lot of the information on the impact on value chains and the phenological reviews could probably be applicable to a bunch of the neighboring countries. So.
There's also a regional project working with the Lake Victoria Lake Basin, and this information is actually somewhat informing. They're going to be doing a vulnerability assessment for that as well. And Uganda is part of that, especially the Lake Victoria Basin part.
Sure. This is Sam Teicher from the White House CEQ. Thank you again for the presentation. And I was curious, with your other reports, did you guys do any focus on marine environments and livelihoods? And if so, what adaptation strategies you guys
we have
had?
two assessments, vulnerability assessments that we did that focused on marine and coastal environments. One was in the Dominican Republic, and the other was in southern Honduras. Okay, so actually you can access those on that.
A question on the phone. It's Eric Hyman, E3EP.
Thank you very much for the presentation. You mentioned, I think, in conclusion, that there are other sectors of the economy or other sectors of rural economy which also may have been influenced by these assessments, and biodiversity, health, and infrastructure were the three that you mentioned. I'm more interested in finding out what aspects of infrastructure would be influenced by these assessments, given that that would have a direct influence on Feed the Future activities as well.
You answer that, or?
I mean, you can add to it too. For this particular overview, we looked at infrastructure related to agriculture. So we focused quite a bit on transport, so routes of transport, and we also focused on storage and maybe markets. Electricity also came into it. It's pretty complex. There's a bit, effects of flooding and things like that, particularly on the roads. Very poor road conditions in Uganda. I don't know if you have anything.
Yeah, I mean, we're just finishing it up, so it's not 100% complete yet. But I think the two aspects that seemed, the biggest one was the transport infrastructure and the impact on the transport infrastructure, just because the transport infrastructure is already so poor to begin with. When you're dealing with unpaved roads, an increase in rain during the dry season can mean all sorts of issues with getting things to market. I think that was the biggest one that was focused on. And then the other issues, I mean, you can talk about post-harvest storage, but there isn't a lot of post-harvest storage yet to talk about. And you could talk about how climate change might affect markets, but there aren't a lot of established markets to talk about. And so a lot of the focus is more around transport infrastructure and the issues around that, and especially the unique challenges with Uganda, because so much of the country is wetlands, that road construction is much more difficult because of that. And then you also have to sort of think about climate change on top of that and what the long-term impacts there will be.
This is Diana Gillespie from APT. I was wondering if you could talk more about how what forums you introduced non-climate and non-ag people in. You mentioned the health, for example, and how you ended up incorporating the information they brought and also translating to them, and how they would utilize this in their own work.
So that most of that work came about at the district level. So most of the work that we did at the national level was really focused on the stakeholders that we had worked with throughout the assessment process. So your usual players with the Ministry of Water and Environment and Ministry of Agriculture. And a lot of the health people came in a little bit later when it came to bringing the information down to the district level. And so those district meetings that I talked about, most of the implementing partners that were there were health and education implementing partners. And we had people break out into different breakout groups, and we ended up doing those by sort of theme. So we would have a health group and an education group. We'd have a natural resource group. We'd have an ag group, and sort of a generalist group. And so it gave people in the health sector an opportunity through facilitated discussion to think about what some of the impacts might actually be. What are some of the impacts on health they might see if dry season, or if you're seeing more how and a lot of the types of things that come up are access to the healthcare centers. Again, transport is an issue. So how is climate change going to affect access to healthcare centers? How is it going to affect disease transmission? How is it going to affect water supply and sanitation? And these are the types of things that were coming up. Because our projects are really focused on agriculture, most of the in-depth work that we're doing to carry this forward is focused a bit more on the agriculture sector. But that being said, Enabling Environment is working on mainstreaming climate change into district development plans writ large. It's not just the agriculture section. And so they're going to be continuing their engagement with the district technical staff that work in health and education to make sure that these things are incorporated there too. I don't know what it's going to look like yet, because they're just sort of starting that work. But it's sort of a nice offshoot, because it's something that we didn't expect would happen, but is now happening at the district level.
Speak a little bit more to communication. One little motto we had within ARC is don't assume that people understand what vulnerability to climate change means. When we went into these communities in various different countries and we did our investigations at the local level, people would talk about climate change, but most often in terms of mitigation. So it was related to their trees and their forests. And so to get them to understand a little bit better what climate change adaptation would say, that not only at the village level, but also with stakeholders in Kampala. And so, we went back to trying to simplify what vulnerability to climate change is. And that's why we use this definition. And we would say, well, first, we need to understand what may happen, what it has been happening, and what may happen in terms of climate change, the trends, future projections. And then based on that, what impact might that have on a particular sector or area like health that we're focusing on. With health, we had to narrow it even a little bit further, because this is potentially a very broad topical areas. So we look specifically at water vector-borne diseases, because that was important in Uganda, and we knew that. And then once you can do your investigation and find out what impact that might have on these water vector-borne diseases, then you can talk about, okay, well, what adaptive capacity is really there locally, not only in terms of individual and community, but also the institutions that really will hopefully help address adaptive capacity and improve resilience over time.
Hi, I'm Ian Fitzsimmons with Still Point Solutions. Did you develop results indicators specifically for the assessment? And if you did, are you making any effort to kind of measure what the long-term effect is post-publication, what long-term effect is in the communities you worked in after the publication?
Well, as Hadas mentioned in the presentation, there were some groups perhaps using it for baseline, but there isn't a plan, as far as I know, to go back and measure. Again, we had quite a few indicators, especially on the adaptive capacity and sensitivity side at the household level, that we did identify and measure, and you'll see that in the report. Okay.
Yeah, Barbara Sugman from DAI. I'm curious as to what kind of champions were, you know, in a position to work with you, to encourage you to take the study in different directions, and then more importantly, to incorporate it and use it as a vehicle for promoting changes that they were working towards. So if you could talk to that aspect of it a little bit.
Well, as you probably could see in this presentation for Uganda, this is our #1 champion right here. And, you know, but in every country where we've done assessments, we haven't had a Hadas. So there's been variable, really, uptake in terms of where the results have gone and the findings. And, you know, Hadas can certainly speak to Uganda, and I think you saw that in the presentation. It was really USAID that stepped up to the plate and said, look, we really, when you come back, we want you to present this with to stakeholders. And they organized the meeting with the Ministry of Agriculture people, the meeting with the research community, with other donors. We actually presented to the agriculture donor group. And that was all USAID that did that, convened that, and organized that. And they really brought it forward. So that was really important. So I think in every country where we've had good uptake, because this is a USAID, we're here to support USAID, it's really been USAID seeing the value of it and stepping up to the plate and bringing it beyond just informing the USAID investment. And timing is also really important. We just found out when we did our assessment in Senegal, it was just completed, that for their UN reporting that they need to do assessments, they want to do assessments in the country, so it turns out that our assessment basically covers the eastern part of the country. So.
And I'll speak to that a little bit because it doesn't happen in a vacuum. The mission in Uganda is very supportive of the climate change work and also of this idea of integrating the climate change work into their agriculture programs. So I had the pleasure of working on this assessment at the very early stages when I was actually based at USAID in Washington in the Africa Bureau working with Tegan. And then when I transitioned to Uganda, I was able to sort of take it up as one of my projects. But the environment there, the enabling environment, one could say, that allowed me to do that was a very supportive mission director and a very supportive office director, a very supportive agriculture team, all of whom wanted this work done and wanted to see this done and were able to sort of, task me with doing this. And the other thing that's been very helpful is that USAID was chairing the agriculture donor group and the climate change donor group at the same time as this was all going on. So we really had a very good convening power amongst the donors and amongst the government because of that, which helped as well. And we've seen, I've seen some of the people that I've seen take this up, at different meetings and been champions for it have been other donors, but also some NGOs. So there's also some really NGOs that are very active in climate change work in Uganda, and they've been very excited about this assessment, and they're the ones who are saying, oh, don't forget about the vulnerability assessment and things like that. And so there's definitely been a lot of people involved in getting this stuff moving. So.
Yeah, Michael Brown with Chemonics. My question has to do with the sort of the perceived value of information at district levels and expectation that stakeholders at the district level, local government, and community members might have, sort of the distinction between information and implementation, e.g. projects. I'm just curious, because it seems like the participation level was really good and people were very enthusiastic and people are interested in the information. Is there sort of some sort of a linked perception that in fact the information is going to lead to projects and implementation at the district level and on down?
So I don't think that would happen unless we followed up. So I think if we just went out and did the one district workshop and presented the information to the districts and had them put together action plans and then left, I don't think we would have gone beyond a little bit more capacity to understand climate change and climate change impacts. I think the reason why it will translate to that is because we have an active project that is essentially quarterly now, engaging with the districts at again, timing, very good timing phase, which is right now is when the districts, this is the time right now when the districts are developing their sort of annual district plans, and they're also preparing to develop their next 5-year plan. So we're at a really good stage in timing right now where they can actually take some of this information, and there's a new set of, there's a new climate change policy in Uganda, there's a new set of climate change mainstreaming guidelines coming down from both the agriculture sector and also just the climate change unit. And so we're at a good phase right now where this project, Enabling Environment, can go back and work with the district and work with the technical staff and work with the planners to actually get this to translate into plans and into projects. One of the really exciting things that they have been doing is they've been working a lot and engaging the Ministry of Local Government and also the Ministry of Finance. And the Ministry of Local Government and the Ministry of Finance both have these planning tools and monitoring evaluation tools that they use to assess progress at the districts at the district level that then get used to set the budgets for the following years. And they've had really good engagement with them, and they're actually getting climate change indicators included. So how a district now does in terms of their climate change adaptation work or climate change mitigation work is now going to be tracked by the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Local Government. And next year's budget is going to depend partially on how well they're doing on this indicator amongst a number of other indicators. So you're actually going to see a link back to funding. And I think that's the key incentive, right? Is they're not just doing it because it's a great thing to do, but they're doing it because it's going to help, help them see better results, help them see more funding, and help them implement programs better. And this project is really making sure to make all of those links so that it's not just an information exchange, but it's really getting down and from the district level getting down to the community level.
Another thing we've done in these assessments is we really, when we look at adaptive capacity is often very local. And so we look very closely at what farmers or what communities are already doing. We do an institutional assessment, so we actively seek examples of interventions that may be effective and could be replicated. So, you try to build on what already seems to be working. And I think that's important for following on. And we always go to the local level in these assessments to have those discussions. And when we get the findings at the higher level, we go back. And we even in other countries, even though we did this in Uganda, but we've done it in most countries since then, we go back to where we conducted the study and we share the results and we have those discussions at a local level.
I'm sorry to come back to this question. The IPC vulnerability assessment of food insecurity, the integrated phasing classification, and what you have done is so interesting in the sense that there is an element of overlap between the two so much. Is your work going to feed into the IPC work that USAID, FAO, and World Food Program is currently doing and is continuing to do?
I'm not sure. I mean, what Hadas said is what we do when we go and do these assessments. We look very closely in the scoping phase at what's already been done and what is in the works and what's the government's involved in, and we try very actively to not duplicate efforts, but to build on that. I'm not sure, but maybe the Senegal case I was just talking about, probably what's happening is it will actually link into that process.
Snodgrass, WRI. So I'm really curious about the national government's reaction or feedback to the assessment. And you mentioned quite correctly that policy change takes a long time. But do you have an inkling of what the Ministry of Agriculture, is thinking about as a result of change that stems from the assessment that you've done?
So some of the stuff I didn't mention was that the timing of this assessment and the timing of of USAID's sort of engagement on climate change in Uganda was also very well timed from the national policy perspective, which is that a national climate change policy was drafted in 2012 and was sort of in the process of being presented and revised and approved, and is still in the process of being approved up until now. It's very close, so they say. So we're actually in a phase where there's been a lot of increased awareness at the national level about climate change, and the policy has a very detailed sort of costed implementation plan that goes along with it that really specifies what are some of the priority actions in the different sectors. And the climate change unit was stood up in the Ministry of Water and Environment and is now going to probably transition to a commission, which gives it a higher status, and to sort of really take on implementation of this policy. And so a lot of these discussions were going on simultaneously with this assessment, which was very useful. And so what this assessment has been able to feed into is not the policy itself necessarily, but how the policy will be implemented, specifically within the agriculture sector. And again, because of our enabling environment activity and our engagement, what we have done is work very closely with the Ministry of Agriculture. They'd had a climate change task force on paper for about a year or two, but they hadn't really moved forward. And using sort of the results of the assessment and the recommendations of the assessment, pulling together that task force, what the activity has been able to do in the last 6 months, in a really short amount of time, is actually pull together an action plan, and the action plans, within weeks of being approved by the Ministry of Agriculture, and hopefully will start to be implemented. So I think what has been particularly helpful isn't just the assessment itself, it's the fact that the assessment has linked to the programs, and the programs are taking up and carrying forward what the assessment says needs to be done. And I think that's how we're getting the engagement with the Ministry of Agriculture, because we have people in there, because looking at the assessment, it was clear we need to engage with the Ministry of Agriculture on X, Y, and Z. So.
Okay, we have 2 questions from online participants. The first one is from Keith Forbes at DAI. And his question is, what level of horizontal resolution did the downscaling have, and how did that benefit or limit the vulnerability assessment?
We don't have our climate scientist with us. Do you know, anybody, Tegan, the resolution of the downscaling?
I knew it, but I can't report, so I can't come right up with the figure right now.
Okay, so they said it's in the report, but they're not sure right now. The next question is also from Keith Forbes at the AI. Given Uganda's recent estrangement from the international community due to recent legislation, what is the scope of follow-on USAID or other donor activities? And don't forget that. She's thinking.
So, given some of the recent legislation that has been passed in Uganda that affects human rights pretty significantly, there has been action taken by some donors to pull out funds. Most of the donors that have sort of decided to sort of pull out were donors that have previously been affected by a scandal in the office of the Prime Minister, where some of their funds were embezzled, and so I think they had already stopped funding and then decided to just pull out. A lot of the other donors and also U.S. aid are in the process of reviewing our engagement with Uganda, looking at it at a bigger picture level in terms of, you know, over the next 5 years, over the next 10 years, how are we going to continue to engage with Uganda? In what ways are we going to continue to engage with Uganda? We're not making any snap decisions. We're not, you know, stopping programs. There have been a couple directives that have been discussed publicly where certain activities are being transitioned to other things. A little less direct support to the government, specifically a change in some of the ways in which we're doing some of our tourism activities. But really, there's a review process that's ongoing that's looking at our aid to Uganda and what these things might mean for the bigger picture and the longer term.
Thanks, guys. That was great. One way that, if you haven't done it already, to get this out for others to use, maybe, is to post it, whatever it is, to the UNFCCC program. And then it would be beyond that. It's a place some people may go and look for things. But it would certainly be there for the Uganda delegation and get into their next national communication. And we can talk about how to do that. Oh, Lisa, I could talk. Any last questions? All right, let's thank Hadas and Trish again. The next one will be whatever the third Thursday of July is, 17th. And we will let you know where it is, and we'll let you know before the 17th. It'll be somewhere near here. Thank you for coming. And if you didn't get to sign in, a couple people came a little bit late. Please let us know who you are if you want to hear from us and get an update on the next one. If you don't, you can just slip on out. Thanks a lot.